Hi guys, welcome to Tactic Devs. In today's video, I'll be showing you guys how to navigate between pages in WPF with the help of a frame control. Now, a frame control is simply a content control that supports navigation. So that means you can actually set its content to any type. However, pages are the preferred way of packaging content that's intended for navigation. So without further delay, let's get to the coding. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to create a landing page. This will be kind of like the home page of the application. And this will contain some clickable controls. And once these controls are clicked, some logic will be executed to navigate to a specified page. Now the controls will be clickable, but their visual appearance will contain an image and some text. Something similar to what you see when browsing through folders. That's an icon and some text. And they will also contain some extra information about the page that we intend to navigate to. Now, because WPF doesn't have such a control, that means I'll have to create a custom control to suit what I need. So that's the first step I'm going to be taking. I'll create a custom control, and then we can go to the implementing of the navigation. Okay, so here in my project, I'll go to the project, and then I'll add new item. So under the WPF tab, I'll select custom control, and I'll just give it a name, nav button. Okay, so Visual Studio added in a class, which is the nav button class that inherits from the control class. I'll go ahead and get rid of this summary. Now, because I want this control to be clickable, I'll inherit from the button base class. And I'll import the namespace Windows controls primitives. Now, because this button is going to contain an image and some text as well as some extra information, I'm going to define properties that are going to store that information. So I'll define a dependency property, and this property will be of the type image source. And I'll give it a name, image source. I'll set its owner class to nav button because it belongs to this class, and I'll set its default property to no. Let me get rid of this comment there and place this field at the top. I'll define another property, and this will have the type of string, and I'll give it a name, text. I'll also set its default data to no. And get rid of this comment as well. And set the field at the top. Now, I also want to hold extra information about the page that I intend to navigate to, and I'll store this information in form of a URI object. This will be very useful when it comes to navigating. So I'll create a dependency property, and this will be of the type URI, and I'll give it a name, nav URI. I'll set its default data to no. and place the field at the top here. So at this point, this is what this nav button UI control is going to need for now. And now when Visual Studio creates a custom control, it also includes a folder, and this folder is called the themes folder, and it contains a file called generic, which is simply a resource dictionary that contains a style to this nav button here. So if I open up this file, you can see it's a resource dictionary and it contains a style, and this style targets the nav button, and it also sets a control template. So simply this would define the appearance of the control that we just created. So I'm going to add in a couple of things. Now I'm going to leave this border as is. Now I'm going to add in a grid, and I'll split this grid into 2 rows. Now the first row is going to have a height of 50 pixels, and the second row's height will be set to auto. So by actually placing the star character, that sets that to auto. Now inside this grid, I'm going to define an image, and I'll place this image inside the first row of the grid. So by defining the grid row property, I'll set that to 0, which means it will be placed in the first grid. And I'll set the source of this image to the image source that was defined in this class. So I can do that by actually using a template binding, and I'll access that property, which is image source here. So the image that will appear here will actually come from the class, which is the button class. Okay, I'll set its stretch to uniform, and I'll set its margin to 2 pixels. I'm also going to add in a text block. I'll place it in the second row. Its text property, I'll create a template binding, and I'll bind it to the property that we created, which is the text property here. I'll set its text alignment to center, and text wrapping property will be set to wrap. I'll also give it a margin of 2 pixels. Okay, so let me see. Okay, that's great. Now I would like that whenever the mouse enters this control, a line is drawn around the control, a dotted line. So I can do that by adding in a rectangle, because a rectangle allows us to create a dotted stroke, which is the line around the rectangle. So I'll use a rectangle control. So by adding that to the grid, I'll set its fill to transparent, because at the moment we only want to use the stroke. Then I'll set its stroke property to royal blue. Now for me to define a dotted line, I need to define to assign the property, which is the stroke dash array. So I'll just do 1, 2, and I'll also set its stroke thickness. I'll set that to 0. So initially, when the control is in its normal state without the mouse cursor over it, this rectangle which will be around it will actually have no stroke, so it won't appear because its fill is also set to transparent and the stroke will be 0. So it should only appear whenever the mouse hovers over it. Now I'm going to place this rectangle in both rows, and I can do that by setting the grid row span to 2. So it just simply means this rectangle won't be confined to one row. It will actually fill both rows of the rectangle, so it will actually take the size of the rectangle. And I also give it a name. I'll give it a name line. Now for me to get the behavior of whenever the mouse cursor hovers the control, the line appears, I need to define some triggers here. So I'm going to define some triggers for the control template. So that's control So this trigger will actually target a property, and that property will be is mouse over. So it will be listening for this value, and whenever this mouse hover property is set to true, it's going to actually set some property here. So I'm going to place in a setter inside. So this setter will actually target a property of stroke thickness. And I'll specify which element I want to set the stroke thickness. So I'll just specify the name, the target name, and that's the line. So I want to set the line's thickness to 1 whenever the mouse hover is true. So that will actually cause the dotted line to appear around control. So apparently the control has been created. I'll just define another setter here. So this setter is going to target the whole control. It's going to set a margin around the control. So I'll target the margin property and set the value to 2 pixels. Alright, so apparently this is the control. So I'll just go ahead and build the solution. Alright, so the solution was built successfully. So I'll just go to the main window here. Now earlier on in my project, I added in a folder called images, and I'll be using these images for setting the image icon on the control I just created. Now it's important that when you use images in your application, that you set the build action to resource and the copy to output directory property, set that to always copy. So remember to do that on all of the images here. That is very important because at some point at runtime, the application is going to look for the images. And if you haven't specified where the images will be found by copying them to the output directory, it might cause a runtime glitch where the images don't appear. Okay, so I'll just go ahead and test the control I created. So I'll just type in nav button, and you can see it appears here under the local namespace. Okay, now I'll just set the text. Okay, what I'll do is I'll resize it. Just here in the properties, I'll go to layout. I'll set it to center. Okay, now it's here. So I'm going to define a text property which we created earlier on. I'll just try Jamie, and we can see it appears here, Jamie. Now what I'm going to do is I'm also going to define the image by setting the image source property. So right here in the properties panel, I'll just navigate to the bottom tab here, and we can see there's a property here. It's called image source. So I'll just click on an image. So I'll just go for accounts. Okay, so we can see that the control has an image and a text. Okay. All right. Now I'll also set the is mouse over property. I'll set that to, okay, I'll just leave that for now. Okay, so I'll just go ahead and delete this control. Now what I'm going to do here is I created a folder called pages. So I'm going to create some pages as well as the landing page. So just go to add page. So I'm going to create a page based on the images here. So I'm going to create a page called accounts. Okay, so the accounts page was added. I'll just set the grid's background color to black. Sorry, I'll set it to white actually. Okay, now I'm going to place a label in the grid. And I'll define some content. I'll just add in some text. I'll give it a font size of 50 pixels. Now I'm going to place this label just at the center of the grid by setting the horizontal alignment and the vertical alignment to center. Okay, great. Now this would define the page accounts. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to add in a button, and this button will be placed at the corner here. Now this button is going to allow us to navigate backwards. So I'll just define a button. I'll set its height to 25 and horizontal alignment to left and vertical alignment to top. Okay, so here's our button. In fact, I'll just get rid of that height. I'll set its content to some text back. I'm going to give it a margin on the left of 5 pixels, 10 pixels, and on the top 10 pixels. Okay, so that's the back button, and I also give it a padding of 5 pixels. I'll set its border thickness to 0. So this button will be responsible for navigating us backwards. Now there's something interesting about WPF and the way it's actually designed. So there's a class called the navigations command class. This class contains some commands that will be very useful. So let me go to the main window, xaml.cs file here, and I'll just type in navigation commands. So I'll press F12 to navigate to the class definition. So this navigations command class has got a couple of commands that we can use, and one of them is browse back here. So this command is responsible for browsing back. Now let's go to the accounts page here that we created. Now because this is a page, and this page will be hosted inside a frame, which is actually a navigation host. Now when we use the browse back command, it's going to notify the host to browse backwards based on the history. So if we browse to the accounts page from the landing page and we click this button, that's actually going to execute the browse back command. It's going to alert the hosting which is the hosting control, which is actually the frame, to browse back to the landing page. So I'll just define the command for this button here, and I'll just say navigation commands browse back. Now apparently we see an error here, so if I build the solution, this error is going to disappear. So I'll just go ahead and do that. Okay, so the solution was built successfully and the error went away. So what I'm going to do at this stage is I'm going to add a couple extra pages, and I'm also going to add the landing page. Alright, so I added in a couple more pages here. I also added in a landings page. So I'll just go ahead and close this accounts page and this class. Okay. Now what I'll do is I'll open up this landings page. And I'll just give it a background of white. So I'm going to place in the control that I just created, which is the nav back control. I'll place in a couple of them here. So I'll first define a wrap panel. Now at this point we can't see the nav button control appearing here because this page exists in a different namespace. It exists in the pages folder here, so it actually exists in the page navigations pages namespace. But our control here exists in the page navigation namespace. So I need to define a namespace here. So I'll just start by copying. I'll change this name. I'll just give it any random thing. I'll just give it N. And I'll get rid of these pages here. So our control exists inside this page navigation namespace, and that's because it's in the root of the project. Okay, so now I'll add in a navigation button, and you see here namespace N, the namespace we just defined. So I'll set its property, text property, I'll set that to accounts. Okay, so here we see accounts. Now I'm going to set a padding of 5 pixels. Sorry, a margin of 5 pixels around this wrap panel. So that the controls move slightly inwards. So on this nav button, right in the properties panel, I'm going to set the image source to images accounts here. So we have the control there. Now, if you remember earlier on, I defined a property which is the nav URI. So that's a property that holds information about the page that we intend to navigate to. So I'm going to set that property as well here. Now I can set it just by typing the path to a page, or I can actually use the properties panel here. And the thing about Visual Studio is when you create a custom control and you define certain properties that it can recognize, it's going to help you in terms of productivity by making it easier for you to just set that property. So here you can see it, nav URI, the property is appearing here, and it actually sets a combo box here, and just by clicking this drop down we can select. So I'll just select the pages accounts page here. So it's going to store that information in form of a URI object. So based on this text, it's going to create a URI object and store it in that variable. Now I'm going to do this for the rest of the pages, and we'll continue from there. Alright, so I went ahead and added in a couple more nav button controls, and I also assigned them properties. Now, because the nav button inherits from the button base class, it also inherits an event called the click event. Now I can set event handlers on each individual nav button control here, but that won't be good practice. Instead, I'm going to set the handler on the parent, which in this case is the grid. So I'll just type in button base, click, and I'll add in a new handler. So basically what happens here is the nav button technically inherits from the button base class. So it's actually a button base. So if an event is raised when I click this nav button, it's going to look for an event handler. But since I haven't defined one on the button, it's going to move up to the wrap panel, and the wrap panel doesn't have, it will now move to the grid. And if it finds the button base click event handler defined, it's going to execute the code that's going to be implemented in that event handler. This is called event routing. Now if I go to the landing page here, the code behind, you can see an event handler has been added here. Now this page, which is landing, inherits from the page class. Let's just go to this class. So there's an interesting property called the navigation service property here. So it gets the navigation service that the host is using to manage navigation. Okay, so if we go to the code behind here, so there's a property called navigation service. So it will get the navigation service that the frame is using, because this page will be hosted in the frame. So we can actually access the navigation service of the frame using this property. Now when this event is raised, I can actually get the element that was clicked by using this argument here. Now that element can be any element inside the grid that is a button base type. So that's the navigation button. So what I'll do is I'll create a variable here, and I'll just give it a name, clicked button. So using this E that's returned, so E, then I'll type in original source. So I can actually get the object where the click event originated from. Now I need to cast this object. Now in my case, I know it's a nav button. So I'll just type in, I'll cast it to a nav button. Okay, now using the navigation service property here, it contains a method called navigate here, and this navigate method can take in some arguments, and one of the arguments is it can take in a URI object. Now we know that we stored a URI inside the nav button here, so we can use that property. Now if we go back to the landing page here, you can see that each nav button has got nav URI, and we saved the page that we intend to go to. So we'll be using this property. So using that property, we can just type in clicked button, then nav URI. Okay, so this will navigate us to the URI that's saved in this property. Okay, so that's it for the landing page. So that's the landing page and the code behind. Now I'll go to the main window here. And I'll add in a frame. Now I want the frame's default page, or the initial page, to be set to the landing page. So I'm going to define a source here. So source will be simply the page that I want to navigate to, but I'll choose that source in the properties panel here. So under source, I'll just click and I'll look for the landing page. Okay, and I also set the navigation UI visibility, sorry. So I'll set that visibility to hidden. So it prevents a toolbar from appearing at the top of the frame, and that toolbar contains some buttons, so that we just see the page that's being hosted. Okay, so I'll go ahead and test the program. Alright, so the application is up and running. So I'll just go ahead and click the accounts button here, and it navigates me to the accounts page. I'll click back here and I go back. I'll click on employees, and here we are back. I'll click on settings and we go to the settings page, and I'll go back. So that's it, guys, and I hope you learned something, like navigation and creating a custom control. So thanks for watching, and remember to like, share and subscribe. It really helps me in bringing out this content. See you in the next one.